The director called me dead weight in front of the entire executive floor, then had security walk me out before lunch. By midnight, my phone showed 61 missed calls, and the company's most expensive secret had finally surfaced. Monday mornings were predictable. By 8:30, someone from finance would call about a report. By 9 o'clock, operations would discover another overnight system alert. And before lunch, somebody would inevitably say the same 4 words. "Has Lauren seen this?" For 12 years, I had quietly kept Graybridge Logistics running. Not because I held a fancy title, not because anyone celebrated my work, because the company's oldest operational platform, the one everyone dismissed as the legacy system, still processed thousands of shipments, payroll records, and warehouse updates every single day. Most executives forgot it existed until it stopped working. I had just finished correcting a warehouse synchronization issue when Brooke Ellis from finance appeared beside my desk. "You got the meeting invite?" I nodded. 10 o'clock, she lowered her voice. "Olivia Bennett is coming." That surprised me. Our new CEO had been in the building for barely 3 weeks. Unlike most executives, she didn't spend her mornings giving speeches. She walked departments, asked questions, and listened far more than she talked. Which explained why Brandon Pierce looked irritated every time she appeared. As operations director, Brandon loved control. He liked polished presentations, perfect charts, simple explanations. What he didn't like were people who knew enough to question his decisions. Unfortunately, I was one of them. At exactly 10, the conference room filled. Department managers took their seats. Team leads opened laptops. Olivia sat quietly near the center of the table, with nothing more than a notebook and a pen. Brandon remained standing. "Let's talk about modernization," he announced. The first few slides were harmless: budgets, efficiency, future initiatives. Then my name appeared: Lauren Brooks. Underneath it, another title: Legacy Systems. Brandon smiled. "If this company wants to compete over the next decade, we have to stop protecting outdated technology." Nobody reacted. He clicked again. "And we also have to stop protecting the people who insist on keeping it alive." Every head slowly turned toward me. Brandon folded his arms. 12 years in the same position, he paused. 12 years without meaningful innovation. Another click. "The company has carried dead weight long enough." The words landed like shattered glass. Nobody spoke. Brooke stared at the table. Someone near legal shifted uncomfortably in their chair. Across the room, Olivia didn't interrupt. She simply watched. I waited until Brandon finished. "May I answer?" He gestured theatrically. "Please." "You've rejected every modernization proposal I've submitted." His smile barely moved. "They weren't ready. I have 7 years of emails saying otherwise." A few managers looked up. I continued calmly. "Every proposal included a phased migration plan. Every proposal reduced operational risk. Every proposal was declined by operations." I didn't have to say his name. Everyone knew who headed operations. Brandon answered before anyone else could. "Those projects were too expensive." I looked at Olivia. "Would you like copies?" The room went still. The new CEO finally spoke. "Do you still have them?" "I have every version." Brandon cut in immediately. "They're outdated." Olivia didn't even glance at him. I asked Lauren. It was the first crack in Brandon's confidence, small, almost invisible, but I saw it. He cleared his throat. This discussion isn't productive. No, I replied. It isn't going the way you expected. For a second, I thought he might lose his temper. Instead, he smiled. The same practiced smile he'd worn through budget meetings, layoffs, and quarterly reviews. Then let's continue this privately. He closed his laptop. The rest of you are dismissed. Chairs scraped across the floor. People filed out without making eye contact. Only Brooke hesitated before leaving. She looked back once, not with pity, with concern. As I reached the conference room door, a quiet voice stopped me. Lauren, could you stay for a moment? It wasn't Brandon. It was Lisa Moreno from Human Resources. She stood beside the door, holding a thick blue folder against her chest. She didn't look angry. She looked uncomfortable. And in that instant, I realized the meeting had never been about modernization. Someone had already decided how my day was supposed to end. If Brandon believed calling me dead weight was enough to erase 12 years of experience, he was about to make the most expensive decision of his career. Lisa Moreno waited until the last person left before closing the conference room door. The click of the latch sounded louder than it should have. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Would you come with me? She didn't need to explain. I had seen that blue folder before, just never with my name on it. We walked through the executive floor without saying a word. Conversations stopped as we passed. A few people pretended to answer emails. Others suddenly became fascinated by the view outside. Corporate offices have an unwritten rule. Nobody wants to be seen watching someone else's worst day. Inside the HR office, Lisa placed the folder on the desk. I want you to know this decision was submitted yesterday. Yesterday. Not after the meeting. Not after the discussion. Before Brandon had called me dead weight. The meeting had been theater. The outcome had already been decided. She slid a document across the desk. Employment termination. Reason? Position eliminated as part of operational restructuring. I looked up. Interesting. Lisa frowned. What is? He called me dead weight because of my performance. I tapped the paper. This says my position is being eliminated. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The contradiction was sitting between us in black ink. I'd like copies of everything. Of course. And written confirmation that my access is being disabled immediately. She blinked. Most people don't ask for that. I'm not most people. A faint smile crossed her face. No, I suppose you're not. 20 minutes later, I was back at my desk. 2 security officers stood several feet away, looking more embarrassed than I felt. Brooke hurried over. Lauren, tell me this is some kind of mistake. I wish I could. She lowered her voice. What are they thinking? I glanced toward Brandon's glass office. They think systems run themselves. She let out a nervous laugh. Neither of us believed it. I packed slowly, a framed picture of my parents, a coffee mug with faded lettering, a sweater that had lived on the back of my chair for years. Then I opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a thick black notebook, 12 years of handwritten recovery procedures, emergency contacts, vendor workarounds, temporary fixes for bugs that software vendors had never managed to solve. Nothing confidential, nothing copied from company files. Just thousands of hours of personal experience written in my own words. A shadow fell across my desk. Brandon, leave the notebook. It's mine. It contains company knowledge. It contains my handwriting. His smile tightened. That knowledge belongs here. I closed the notebook and placed it inside my box. If the company wanted documentation, I said evenly, it had 7 years to approve it. For the first time all morning, he didn't have a comeback. He simply stared. I picked up the box. Good luck. He laughed. We won't need it. I held the elevator door as the security officers caught up. I hope you're right. The doors closed. That was the last time I saw Brandon Pierce as my boss. The drive home took 43 minutes. For the first 20, my company phone stayed silent. Then it buzzed. Critical system alert. Warehouse replication queue delayed. I ignored it. Another vibration. Critical system alert. Payroll reconciliation failed. Another. Inventory synchronization timeout. By the time I reached my driveway, there were 11 alerts waiting. I carried the box inside, set it on the kitchen table, and made myself coffee. For the first time in 12 years, those alerts weren't my responsibility. The phone rang. Brandon Pierce. I watched it until the screen went dark. 30 seconds later, he called again. Then the infrastructure manager. Then the operations manager. Then IT. I turned the phone over. 5 minutes passed. Curiosity won. I flipped it back. 18 missed calls. A new text from Brooke appeared. Lauren, something's happening. The overnight processing won't restart. Nobody can find the recovery binder. Brandon keeps saying you never documented anything. I stared at the message. He knew that wasn't true. Every recovery procedure had been documented. Every migration proposal had been written. Every risk had been reported. He had rejected them all. The phone vibrated again. This time, the caller ID didn't say Brandon Pierce. It said Olivia Bennett. I let it ring. When the screen finally went dark, one thought crossed my mind. If the CEO was calling personally on my first afternoon away from the company, whatever was happening inside Graybridge Logistics was already far worse than Brandon was willing to admit. You might think 18 missed calls sounded desperate. They were only the beginning. If you've ever watched someone abuse their power and thought they'd never face the consequences, you're going to want to stay for what happens next. Subscribe and tell me in the comments, would you have answered Olivia's call? Tuesday morning felt strangely quiet. For the first time in 12 years, I wasn't rushing to check overnight alerts before my coffee finished brewing. My work laptop was gone, my company badge sat in a cardboard box on the kitchen counter, and Graybridge Logistics was no longer my responsibility. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. My phone shattered the silence before 8:30. It was Brooke Ellis. The moment I answered, I knew something had gone terribly wrong. She wasn't crying, but she was speaking too fast to breathe properly. Lauren, they shut down Warehouse 3. I frowned. Why? There was a pause, followed by a muffled argument somewhere behind her. Brandon ordered IT to restart the synchronization service. Twice. I slowly set my coffee on the table. They weren't supposed to do that. Brooke didn't answer immediately. She didn't have to. The silence on the other end told me she'd already figured out what those words meant. A manual restart before the overnight reconciliation finished wouldn't solve the delay. It would duplicate transactions, confuse inventory records, and leave the warehouse unable to tell what had actually shipped. Then the shouting grew louder. Someone yelled, "Stop every outbound truck!" Another voice fired back, "We already have 47 waiting at the docks." Brooke whispered, almost to herself, "This place is falling apart." An hour later, my company phone began vibrating again. Brandon Pierce called first. I ignored it. Seconds later came Kevin Doyle from IT, then the infrastructure manager, then operations, then Brandon again. By lunchtime, the screen showed 29 missed calls, yet none of them left a voicemail. That told me more than any message could have. They weren't asking for help. They expected it. After 12 years of solving every crisis before anyone noticed it existed, they still believed I would pick up simply because the company needed me. I turned the phone face down and tried to focus on anything else, but another call from Brooke pulled me back into the chaos. "You should have seen the conference room," she said. "Brandon gathered every manager and promised everyone the outage would be fixed before the end of the day." I couldn't help asking, did anyone actually believe him? She let out a tired laugh. "Not after customer service announced they've logged more than 800 complaints since this morning." Brooke lowered her voice before continuing. Then Olivia walked in. I expected her to say the new CEO had taken over the meeting or confronted Brandon in front of everyone. Instead, Brooke surprised me. She didn't interrupt him. She waited until he finished talking, then asked one question. I leaned back in my chair. What question? Brooke repeated it word for word. Who approved rejecting Lauren Brooks' migration proposals? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Brandon said there were never any viable proposals, Brooke continued. But Olivia didn't argue. She looked at someone from legal and said, "Please verify that before the end of the day." That was it. No accusations, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. Yet I knew exactly what had just happened. Brandon had made the mistake of turning a simple lie into something that could be checked. If legal searched the archives, they'd find every proposal I'd submitted over the past 7 years, and every rejection bearing operations approval. For the first time since I'd been escorted out of the building, I wondered if the system failure wasn't Brandon's biggest problem anymore. Just after 2 p.m, Brooke called again. This time, she skipped the greeting. North River Medical suspended all outbound shipments through Gray Bridge. I felt my stomach tighten. North River wasn't just another customer. They were one of the company's largest contracts. Losing them, even temporarily, would send shockwaves through every executive meeting for months. "What's Brandon saying?" I asked. "He's still calling it a temporary outage," Brooke replied, "but nobody believes him anymore. Finance can't reconcile inventory, customer service is overwhelmed, warehouse managers are refusing to release trucks without verified manifests, and Olivia has been in meetings with legal almost all afternoon." I walked to the window and watched the rain begin to fall again. Brandon had spent years convincing everyone the legacy system was obsolete, yet the moment it stopped behaving exactly as expected, the entire company seemed to lose its balance. Ironically, the software wasn't what had failed first. Leadership had. Around 3 p.m, my company phone vibrated once more. I picked it up almost absent-mindedly. 34 missed calls. Brandon had called 6 times. IT had called 4. Operations, infrastructure, HR, and 2 managers I barely knew had all tried to reach me. Then the screen lit up again, but this time the name was different. Olivia Bennett. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. A voicemail appeared almost instantly. I hesitated for a moment before pressing play. "Lauren, this is Olivia Bennett. I'm not calling to ask you to fix today's problem." She paused long enough for the words to sink in. "I'm asking for 30 minutes of your time because I believe someone has been lying to both of us." The message ended, leaving the kitchen completely silent. For the first time since I'd left Graybridge Logistics, the story was no longer about a broken system. It was about discovering who had broken the truth first. I didn't return Olivia's call that afternoon. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, and certainly not because I enjoyed watching Graybridge struggle. I simply refused to make another decision while emotions were still running the show. Brandon had fired me less than 24 hours earlier, escorted me out with security, and publicly called me dead weight. Now the company's leadership suddenly wanted my time. Those were two very different realities, and I wasn't about to pretend one erased the other. I set my phone aside and spent the next hour doing something I hadn't done in years. I organized my own files instead of someone else's. My personal notebook, old project binders, printed migration timelines, and archived emails covered the dining room table. 7 years of proposals, 7 years of risk assessments, 7 years of warnings that delaying modernization would eventually create a single point of failure. Every proposal had been submitted, every proposal had been rejected, and every rejection carried the same approval chain. Shortly after 4, Brooke called again. This time she sounded exhausted rather than panicked. "Lauren, legal has been in the records archive all afternoon. I stopped sorting papers." "Looking for what?" "Everything with your name on it." She let out a slow breath. Brandon told Olivia those migration proposals either never existed or were unfinished drafts. Then legal found the document register. I smiled despite myself. Every formal proposal submitted at Graybridge received a tracking number before anyone even opened the file. You couldn't simply pretend it had never existed. "What happened?" I asked. Brooke lowered her voice. "They found the first proposal, then another, then another." Someone from legal asked why every single rejection came from operations. She paused. "Lauren," Brandon walked out of the room without answering. For the first time since my termination, the conversation inside Graybridge had shifted away from the outage itself. The warehouse delays were getting worse, customer complaints continued to climb, and finance still couldn't reconcile inventory. But those problems suddenly had competition. Executives were beginning to ask a far more dangerous question. How had one director managed to block every modernization effort for years while blaming the consequences on the very person trying to prevent them? An operational crisis could usually be repaired. A leadership failure was much harder to explain, especially to a board of directors. Brandon had spent years controlling the narrative. Now documents were beginning to tell their own story. And unlike employees, documents didn't get intimidated in conference rooms. At 6 that evening, my company phone vibrated again. 39 missed calls. A few minutes later, it became 42. Then 45. Brandon had stopped calling altogether. Instead, the names on the screen belonged to people I'd rarely heard from. The chief financial officer, the vice president of supply chain, corporate counsel, even the head of enterprise technology. None of them left a voicemail. They didn't know what to say. They couldn't ask me to work without acknowledging I'd been fired, and they couldn't discuss the situation without creating legal complications. Their silence said everything. The company was no longer trying to solve a technical problem. It was trying to survive an executive one. Just before 7, my personal phone rang again. Olivia Bennett. This time, I answered. "Lauren," she said, her voice calm as ever. "Thank you." "I haven't agreed to anything." "I know," she replied. "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking if we can meet tomorrow morning." I waited. "There are several things I need to verify before this goes any further." "What things?" There was a brief pause. "I've just authorized an internal audit." The words landed harder than I expected. "And," she continued, "the board has scheduled an emergency meeting for tomorrow afternoon." Outside, the last light of the day disappeared behind the clouds. I realized this had grown far beyond missed shipments or broken software. The systems inside Graybridge could eventually be repaired. The trust inside its executive offices might not be. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, and for a brief second I found myself standing in the exact same spot where security had escorted me out 2 days earlier. The only difference was that nobody was avoiding eye contact this time. Conversations stopped, but not out of embarrassment. People simply watched. Some nodded. Brooke offered a faint smile from across the hallway before disappearing back into finance. Olivia Bennett was already waiting outside the boardroom. She walked over without assistants, without lawyers, without the usual executive entourage. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Before we go inside, I need to tell you something." I waited. "You were treated unfairly. That happened on my watch, and I take responsibility for it." There was no attempt to soften the words or explain them away. "I'm not asking you to forgive the company today," she continued. "I'm asking you to help us understand exactly how we got here." I gave a small nod. "Then let's find out." The boardroom was silent except for the sound of papers being organized. Brandon Pierce sat halfway down the table, his usual confidence replaced by a stack of binders and a glass of water he hadn't touched. Internal Audit had already connected a projector to the large display. One of the auditors stood and addressed the room. "Our review covered all modernization proposals submitted over the last 7 years. The first document appeared on the screen. Proposal 18-204. Author, Lauren Brooks. Status, rejected by operations. The second followed immediately. Proposal 19-031. Same author, same outcome. Then another, and another. 7 proposals, 7 technical reviews, 7 risk assessments, warning that delaying modernization would eventually create a critical operational failure. Every single one had reached Brandon's office. Every single one had been rejected. One of the board members leaned forward. "Mr. Pierce, did you review these proposals before rejecting them?" Brandon cleared his throat. "Yes, but the projected costs—" The auditor interrupted by displaying another email. It carried Brandon's signature beneath a single sentence. "Delay the migration another fiscal year. We don't need to explain unnecessary spending to the board." No one spoke. Another email replaced it. "Keep Lauren focused on maintenance. We are not discussing replacement until after quarterly reporting." Then another. "If the system is still functioning, there's no reason to create a problem that doesn't exist." Brandon finally reached for the glass of water, but his hand wasn't as steady as it had been during the meeting where he'd called me dead weight. Across the table, nobody looked surprised anymore. They looked disappointed. The lead auditor changed slides. Let's discuss the financial impact. A chart filled the screen. Emergency freight costs, customer compensation, warehouse shutdowns, contract penalties, delayed medical shipments. The total climbed line by line until it stopped at $13.6 million. This figure reflects the first 36 hours only, the auditor explained. Additional losses are still being calculated. Brandon tried one last defense. The outage wasn't caused by my decisions. It was caused by an aging system. Olivia spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun. Her voice remained calm. No, Brandon. The aging system was a business risk. Ignoring every recommendation to replace it was a leadership decision. The room fell silent again. One board member closed his folder. Another quietly removed his reading glasses. No debate followed because there was nothing left to debate. The chairman looked toward Brandon. Pending completion of the board investigation, your executive authority is suspended, effective immediately. Brandon opened his mouth as though searching for an argument, but none came. 2 members of corporate security were already waiting outside the glass doors. It struck me how different this moment felt from my own departure. Nobody escorted him out because they thought he was dangerous. They escorted him out because they could no longer trust him with the company. As he walked past me, he slowed for just a second. Our eyes met. He didn't apologize. I didn't speak. Some conversations end long before anyone says goodbye. When the room finally emptied, only Olivia and I remained. She placed a single folder on the table, but didn't slide it toward me immediately. Before you read this, she said, I want you to know that no salary increase can undo what happened. I appreciated that more than she probably realized. Then she pushed the folder across the table. Inside was an offer for the newly created position of Director of Operational Resilience, reporting directly to the CEO. The compensation included a 55% salary increase, a $150,000 signing bonus, and full authority over the modernization program that had spent 7 years waiting for approval. I closed the folder without signing it. Olivia raised an eyebrow. One condition? She asked. I smiled faintly. One condition. From now on, no employee is publicly blamed before the facts are verified. She didn't hesitate. Agreed. As I left the boardroom, I walked down the same hallway where security had escorted me out just 48 hours earlier. Nothing about the building had changed. The glass walls were the same. The elevators were the same. Even the coffee station smelled exactly as it always had. The difference wasn't the office. It was the truth. 2 days earlier, Brandon had called me dead weight. In the end, the board reached a different conclusion. The person holding the company back had never been the employee maintaining the system. It had been the executive refusing to face reality.